Welcome to Being Revolutionary.
Greetings, revolutionaries, and welcome to today's episode of Realizing Equity.
But before we get underway, let's make sure to handle our business here, podcast business. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast provider. Make sure to rate us 5 stars. If you're going to rate us 1 star, don't do that.
No.
Just sit on your hands.
Yep.
And make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All you have to do is search Being Revolutionary.
Now that we have that out of the way, welcome to Being Revolutionary. On today's episode, we're going to discuss realizing equity. Not quite a double entendre by definition, but the double meaning hopefully will still apply.
Right. Well, when you think about the word equity, if we just launched into talking about it, you wouldn't probably really know what direction we're going on this. I mean, our investment-oriented clients or, nerds like me would probably think we're going to be talking about stocks, right? Sometimes referred to as equities, or we could be talking about ownership in a company or ownership in a piece of real estate or some sort of partnership, or, if you're Matt and everything comes back to interpersonal relationships and interpersonal relationship drama, then you might be talking about relational equity. Right.
Talk about a double entendre there. Let's talk about, how I live life. It's like, yeah, so I get you.
Absolutely.
Correct. Spot on as usual. So basically, like Nate said, we're going to be talking about probably the most common concept of equity, or what people most often, when you say the word equity, what they think, and that's just basically internal value of an asset. And then there's the other side of that. Or, well, actually, just as an example, be like owning something. So most often the word equity is used with, that's right, home ownership. How much equity do I have? How much intrinsic internal value? If I were to sell my home that I currently own, how much equity or how much value in addition to what I owe or what I paid for it will I have? So anyhow, as we're going to traverse or navigate that subject matter, we're going to kind of, as Nate kind of teased a little bit, we'll dip into sort of what personal equity can mean, and it's in a couple of different categories. It can be personal equity that someone brings on a professional level, right? And then you've got personal equity where it's like a self-realized value. So anyways, so did you want to chime in on some of that?
Well, no, I think that's the concept, is when you think about equity, what it really means is like owned value. And that could be applied in so many different ways. You mentioned personal equity, which is, someone's effectively what their net worth is. It's another way you could think of that. You could think of brand equity, right? Like the value or maybe premium value that certain companies can charge for products or services based on their equity that they have in their brand with the public. So I think that probably the best example of something like that would be a Starbucks coffee or Nike shoes or whatever, maybe an Apple EarPod, right? Which is probably 4x cost over any wireless earbud on the market right now, right? Is it really worth that much more? Probably not, as far as like the parts involved, right. But the loyalty or the trust that people like me have for the brand and what they deliver on is a form of equity as well. They've kind of built up that inherent value of what they do. So that's a form of brand equity. And then we have kind of different forms of ownership as well for us as like consumers or investors. You could have shareholder value. Right. Mm-hmm. So what's the value of what you own in terms of public shares of publicly traded companies? And then, of course, private equity as well. Right. So if you're a business owner out there listening to this and you're either the sole owner of a corporation or maybe you own a corporation with some other partners, then you've got private shares as a part of that company. So there's lots of different forms that the kind of terminology equity can take, all of which are extraordinarily important when we're considering financial planning concepts and having conversations about building a plan, which is what we've been doing kind of throughout this season.
Yeah, and all of those also translate into literal financial gain or loss, but hopefully, like in the case of equity, we're talking about financial gain. Slightly side note here, the Being Revolutionary brand, we're going to start charging all of our listeners twice what we're charging you guys right now because our equity's going up. So,
because our brand equity is so strong.
That's right. Hey, we got renewed for second season. It was just a downhill slide from there. I mean, it's just the natural progression, right? When you meet success, you gotta amp up your fees and stuff. So we are now officially charging everyone who's listening right now twice as much as what we were before. And no, that doesn't mean I'm going to be talking twice as long. I mean, that's a pretty logical.
I fear that's what our listeners would actually be scared of, is if we actually found some success in this, what it might turn into.
Exactly.
This is a pretty egotistical play to begin with on our parts, but but nonetheless, it's a fun exercise for us. So,
right.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
And it is having some positive impact for folks that are listening. So we poke fun at ourselves a lot, which I think is fair game, first of all, but it's also healthy to keep our egos in check. But in the meantime, we actually do. We've got some listeners that have been writing in and have been making comments about different things and how some of our episodes have helped and some have provided much needed comic relief. I take that as a win either way. So hopefully it wasn't the serious stuff that was the comic relief, though.
Yeah. Well, no, it's true. We've gotten some great feedback, which is why we came back for season 2, as we said at the beginning of the season. But realistically speaking, that's where we consistently love hearing back from people. Is we're trying to take these, normally probably pretty bland or heavy or maybe data-driven topics and bring some levity to them, make them a little bit more real world, and have some human being style conversations around these topics, which is, I think, how most people will then end up interacting with them. And so, as always, like if you want to write us and let us know, just shoot us an email at brev@trilogyfs.com. That's BEREV @trilogyfs.com. And let us know what you think.
Yep. Always interested in hearing more, whether it's constructive or not. So yeah, we love hearing from you all. So
well, and as we transition away from kind of that basic concept of kind of the different types of financial equity,
right,
real numbers oriented, then there's this other side of the concept of equity, which is emotional equity, right? So where someone possesses something that's of value, maybe not necessarily financial value,
right?
Though,
yeah.
So
like,
I thought that was kind of an interesting angle to explore as well.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like a lot of folks undervalue their value. To sound redundant, they undervalue themselves. There I go. Now I'm not saying value in the same sense. I absolutely felt that way in my past. Through healthier relationships and healthier employment and everything like that. That's kind of, I still fight that from time to time, but overall, it's something that I think a lot of people tend to devalue themselves through the course of whatever they're doing. And so like one of the examples we have written down here is image. How does Nate view me? What's Nate's image of me and what's my image of myself, to use myself as an example. And I think a lot of the times what happens is, especially folks that tend to devalue themselves, they don't share that same positive image that their coworkers or their friends or their family might. And then that also, I feel like, allows people that may not be as healthy of a impact to speak into their lives as well. And then it just creates this, reciprocating cycle of unhealth or health. Like in my example, I've got examples of both in my life. Like in my history, I've got reciprocating unhealth and I've got reciprocating health. And it's an interesting contrast for me.
Well, that can play in so much onto the earlier concepts we talked about as well on the financial side of things. One of the most interesting things that I've learned 15 years into doing financial advisory work is that it's crazy the amount of people who have such a poor self-image of their own finances that they don't feel they deserve the dignity of a good financial plan, right? I mean, you can probably think of example after example of people we've talked to over the years who have so much shame associated with their past decision making with money that they think they'll just never get it.
Yeah,
Or
it's true.
maybe
Or they
even
don't
worse
deserve
than
it.
that.
Yeah.
Or they don't deserve it, right? Or I did all this stupid stuff when I was in my 20s and 30s, and so here I am, right? I've gotten what I've deserved, and that's, to me, there's so much tied up in our financial decision making, our net worth, and our image of ourselves in Western culture. And is that good? Is it bad? I don't know. It's probably both, but it's also real. So again, it's one of those situations where you may not like it, but like it or not, it's part of the reality of the world we're living in right now, is to kind of figure some of that stuff out and where you sit on that. But I think it can be really helpful as we kind of talk through some of these non-financial equity conversations to kind of think about how these interplay back to some of the financial aspects of things as well, to kind of ping pong back and forth between those two. So that's just the first thing that came to mind when you're talking about self-esteem or self-image. Is my experience with working and conversing with people about their financial plans is the number one barrier to us finding success in a relationship seems to be people's willingness to believe that they can do better and to be curious as to how to do so.
I agree. I think you're really onto something. There's this hyper awareness that happens, especially when they start interacting with like a financial professional. I think actually this probably is the case with like gym trainers, like people that start wanting to improve their health. Physically, it could probably be counselors as well. I can't speak into that directly. I can just tell you that from our experience, I know this to be true. People will tend to get hyper aware, embarrassed. Like, money, talking about finances is one of the most intimate topics you can have a conversation with another person about. But what I have noticed has happened is that hypersensitivity happens, and then that image, that self-image kicks in along with what everybody else has been telling them, whether the input or the influence that these other people are bringing in may be healthy or unhealthy, but it'll usually be this apologetic, like, okay, good example. Just last night I was leading a class, and one of the folks in my class, as we were talking about debt and goals and things like that, they're like, I made a impulse buy last night, and she holds up this cute little like half-pound teacup like Yorkie, like real life dog, and
a dog,
yeah, full on dog, a puppy, and I'm like, okay, like, but here's the thing: she's single, she's out of debt, she's retired, she's got a pension and additional savings to boot, and she's completely meeting her like goals and her like she's fine. There's no problem with that. But she had that self-image because based on the conversation I was having with other folks, she felt guilty by what we were talking about because she didn't like follow the steps that we were talking about. Well, these other folks are in debt. These other folks have different situations. They're not retired. Their income is not like all but guaranteed.
Totally true. And all of this leads back to some of these other reference points that you and I were talking about: intellectual equity, relational equity. There are parts of this where it's us interacting with ourselves and interacting with our own decision making, but inevitably in a social world, which we are a part of, there's equity pieces and parts of our financial equity that will have to interact with other people as well. And so you can think about how you innovate your decision making over time, right? That's kind of the intellectual side of things. So basically, that's a fancy way of saying like how fast you learn and put the new things that you've learned into practice in your life, whether it's behavior oriented things, whether it's skills, whether it's stuff you do at work that creates value for yourself or for your company or your position. And then the relational side of things, are your relationships a net positive or a net negative on your self-image
Yeah.
and on your existence? And that's, I always hesitate to go down those styles of conversations when you're with people, because depending on how much level of trust you have with someone, when you're discussing with them, it can be a little bit hurtful to kind of get into that line of conversation. But the reality of what I've experienced in my life is I can think and look at relationships that I have currently, relationships I've had in the past. And if I were to just kind of think of it as like a half moon scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where there's 50 in the middle, and under 50 is bad and above 50 is good, or below 50 is not helping me and above 50 is helping and pushing me forward. You can kind of identify pretty quickly, if you just think about relationships you have in your life, this is a kind of a net positive or a net negative on my life, who I am now and who I want to become someday, like we so often talk about. And so kind of, it's another one of those, whether we like it or not, it's kind of a fact of life, is we have to make choices in our relationships as well. And part of that is that relationships are reciprocal, either good or bad. And I think this is one of the things where, when you've had some good experiences, it's helpful because you can kind of learn, oh, okay, so there can be healthy relationships that are helpful and mutually beneficial. And then the opposite of that, of course, can be true, where there's kind of toxic relationships too. Yeah. So that, I think that gets mixed up in here as well, and becomes a part of our decision-making process and our self-esteem and the way that we view ourselves as it relates to our life and our money, of course, too.
Absolutely. I mean, not to keep going back on like, this is what I've done in my life and all that sort of stuff. We're not going to beat that to death today. But one of the things that I've learned, and, as we've remarked a few times, you've been there to witness it a lot of the times. One of the things I learned a few years back, it was through this podcast, and it talked about how relationships, there's a price that a person has to pay to be in a healthy relationship. And that's reciprocating. That is for the person, the primary person, and then the relationship that's speaking into that person's life or taking up that person's energy. So like you and I right now, we have a relationship. We have a relationship outside of this podcast and outside of our office. And sometimes, whether you like it or not, the personal bleeds into, like, we'll be talking about something that maybe I'm going through personally or whatever, or something that comes up on your end, and we'll talk about that in the office. But you're giving up your time, your energy, and to listen to what I've got going on. That's the price that you pay. And if I'm not willing to do that in reciprocation to the same level, now maybe we only do that once every couple of weeks. For some people, it could be on a daily basis. Right. If you're really banged up emotionally, it could be happening hourly, and you might be reaching out to that person and they might be reaching out back to you. That'd be quite the volatile situation, I'm sure. But the point is this, is that to have access to my life, I need to have someone that's willing to give their time or their energy, but basically reciprocate the same degree of intimacy that I would be giving to them. And, prior, some years back, that wasn't my case. I would meet, I'd have someone that I had a 2-hour conversation with in my life, and I'd be spilling stuff to them that really should be trusted with someone that I've known for years, not hours. And it just kept generating more and more negative relationships. And that was happening at work, and that was happening in my personal life. And it turned into a big, nasty mess. So what we're going to kind of transition into now is kind of how that looks as a package, like both professionally, because my claim is they all have, like, if you picture like three different circles. So it can be, professional equity, personal equity, but you look at how businesses gain equity or value. You look at how your job gains equity or value, and you look at how your relationships gain equity or value. And I can all but guarantee, I feel, my claim is that each one of those feeds into the other, almost like a circle.
Right. Or you could think of it like a Venn diagram, right? So you have those three overlapping circles, and there are going to be some character traits that are going to cross apply. Because in the end, what are these things made up of, right? What is a business made up of?
Relationships.
People doing things,
Yeah.
right? And relationships. And your life is a function of your relationships in that sense as well. So, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, let's see if we can pull an example, talking about like an equitable or an equity focused business, and then see if we can kind of trail that down through kind of that concept of these overlapping financial and relational equities and how those kind of interplay together for success.
Yeah.
What's a good example of that?
Probably, I mean, Apple's pretty popular. We can kind of try to apply that.
Well, everybody knows it, so it's
Yeah.
a good place to start, right? And it's a drama-filled company historically too,
Oh,
that
yeah.
did things really poorly for a long time as well. So,
Totally.
yeah, I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah. So you look at, what was it? And I'm not horribly familiar. Well, hopefully, Nate, I believe you're going to be more familiar with Apple's history than I am
Yeah.
from a equitable standpoint. But I know that, what was it, 1984? It was around the 80s when Apple started becoming better established, and they were in competition with PC, with Windows, but PC driven or Windows driven computers. And then they kind of fell into a slump, and they weren't. Okay, this is where we're getting in the area where you're going to have to correct me. Weren't they talking about bankruptcy? There was something where their finances were so...
Oh, definitely on the edge several times, right? So they have this big kind of shooting star start, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak kind of really on the cutting edge of computing, right? And so this is when computing was for computing nerds, right? Like basically people who liked building, Gen 1 computers in their garage and putting the parts together and, getting binary code to work.
Yep. Have the
Essentially,
cards
right?
to stamp in, like for the programming and the subroutines and all
exactly.
that sort of stuff.
So kind of functionally, and this is, the mythology really of Steve Jobs for all of his Piccadillys. The one thing he really understood was that he always thought that this was and could be a much more mainstream consumer oriented industry than anybody thought it was at the time. At the time, it was thought to be a very business oriented, number crunching, data driven business as far as profit. And then on the side, it's more of a hobby for nerds, kind of the next generation ham radio in a sense, right?
Or toy trains.
So, yeah.
Sorry, model train replicas.
Right. And so the idea there was that they came to loggerheads several times, and even Jobs was even ousted, as the leader of the company at one point. And, there's these waves of eras, but ultimately what it came down to was the value of what the brand could be. No one ever had a higher realization of that than Jobs himself. His expectations for what Apple were nowhere near anybody else. He was had such a wider perspective of what Apple could be.
Right. Their
rather
image.
than being focused on what we do right now. Yes. Yeah. So that if you want to think of that almost in a sense, like and it was probably people who have written about him, it was probably like almost something that was kind of messed up in his own personality and certainly his leadership style, because it was very abrasive as well, was like he was almost maniacally committed to that. This thing is going to be bigger than anyone ever imagines. And nobody believed it. And I'm going to show you anyways.
Right.
Was kind of that it was leading with his chin from the front edge. And as a result, a lot of people latched onto that, grabbed his ankles as he was flying away. And next thing you know, we have the Apple that we have today over a series of very successful product innovations and services and everything else that they do today. So it was that almost extra worldly personal and professional self-esteem to have the audacity to push that hard and fast for something that didn't ever exist previously.
Right. Let's think about this in true context. When it hasn't been done before, and like that's different. Like to believe in something, to know it to your core. Apple technically started in a garage of a home.
Oh, yeah.
And so, so Steve Jobs' relationship with the other, that would be later be the executive team of Apple, but the other programmers and the other think tankers, those relationships obviously drove his image or his idea, his innovation. Really, that's what we're talking about. He was trying to innovate the industry that barely existed at that time, and he was able to, through his relationship with these other people, motivate, recognize, and ultimately innovate what has become, what later becomes, which is now, that's what I was trying to say, Apple, which is this, billion-dollar company now, right?
Oh, one of the largest brands in the history of the world.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's true. And here's what's so interesting about it is he didn't have an ounce. Well, he had technical knowledge, but in comparison to the highest end people who have worked at Apple from a technical knowledge standpoint, he was not one of them.
Right.
But that's the thing, right? That crossover point of a sense of belief, a sense of self-esteem, and then putting people around you that can fill in the blanks and where your knowledge, skills, and expertise are, that can support and gird and actually follow through and complete the vision, is a really, really important part of the story. And ultimately, I think what you would say is kind of his big picture downfall in the middle, most successful point of his career was he failed to recognize that as well as he should have.
Right.
And then by the end of his career kind of came back around that and became a much more gentle soul in a sense than he was, although still very aspirational all the time. And so that's what's so cool about that, is that you have this kind of vision for what we think we can be, even though if it seems super audacious. And just think about how that can apply back to our own lives, right? I mean, for the person that I was referencing earlier, or people that we've met with who have a really, really negative self-image of their financial lives and who don't really ever believe that they can become financially independent, right? Or that they can get out of debt, or that they could retire comfortably someday. We are kind of put in a position where we need to be that audacious person in their life, right?
Yep.
We need to sit across the desk or whatever, across the Zoom meeting and say, we've been there before. We know you can do it.
Yep.
Like if you'll just kind of like hold our hand and use your other hand to close your eyes and trust me to walk down this path together, we can get some momentum going. And then there will be a series of new beliefs that start to develop off that. And like in the case of Apple, the story goes, Johnny Ive, who became like their lead designer, right? Chief design. Now he's moved on since, but he designed if you remember the old iMacs that were really colorful. I always think of Zoolander trying to get into physically get into the computer.
The files are in the computer.
In the computer, right. But that was it was the prettiest computer that was ever made at the time. And it was like, it just looked nothing like what you would have bought from Dell or IBM or, one of those.
It wasn't cold and hard.
Right?
It was designed to sit in your kitchen or your office.
It was a showpiece of furniture and a technical device, right? And and then of course Johnny Ive was integral in the iPod, and then eventually, of course, the iPhone, which has been the most successful product basically in the history of mankind.
Right.
So, but you look at that and you go, would Johnny Ive have ever worked for Apple were it not for the audacious vision of Steve Jobs?
Right.
No way. No way. He's way too creative, way too kind of ethereal and out there in his thinking and his ethic. And so that creates space for big things to happen, but you have to first dream big, in a sense, to borrow a phrase from our CEO, right? So that's the concept, is create the space for that innovation to happen, then build the relationships and the education and the decision-making metric for moving things forward from that point. And then you have to have a communication structure to keep it all together, because God forbid it actually happens, right?
Yeah.
And everything goes the way you want it to go, or begins building momentum as if it's going that direction, then you've got to be able to continue to grow and develop and innovate so it doesn't come all apart at the seams, at the end.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that that's where that relational equity and communication side of it that you talked about earlier, with that kind of reciprocal, healthy relationships that are so important, personal lives, in our professional lives, and definitely with people that you're consulting with, that you're making big life decisions with.
Yeah. I'm hoping that the point that we're making, and hopefully it's coming across clearly, is that success doesn't have so much to do with finances as it does with equity. Like what you get out of life, what you give to life, and that just naturally tends to replicate itself into like corners and areas of your life that you may not necessarily understand or know or recognize. But at the same time, what I know from my own personal experience is that has equated for me, that has equated into financial success and success in these other areas. And now that I see that clearly, it's a reciprocating relation. It's a reciprocating cycle that happens for me. So the healthier I get in these relationships, the healthier I perform at work, the healthier I become financially, which then makes me feel better about myself. So then I show up to work, bigger and better and bolder, and then it translates into more money. And then, so.
Well, and ultimately, as we've talked about kind of throughout this episode, you have to find a way to be that way. You, the royal you, you listener, you, me,
right.
you. We have to figure out how to be that way, because if we don't, it is very much that treadmill-like philosophy where you are either moving forward in these types of areas or you are slipping backwards. There's not really a kind of, I just hang.
Right.
I reached a particular level. And if you listen to people who are very kind of recreative of themselves, which to me are the most inspiring people, right? People who have found success and then have refound it and then have refound it.
Yeah.
That kind of innovative,
replication,
creative type.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That the thing that is most common throughout that type of person is that they recognize that growth is a part of who you are. It's not something that you do.
Right.
And I think that that's ultimately, when it comes back to providing financial advice or helping people oversee their financial plans, it's something I've said for a really long time. Like, you don't invest, you are an investor. There's a massive Grand Canyon sized gap between those two concepts. Anybody can buy stock on Robinhood.
Right.
Very few people live a life of discipline for 50, 60, and 70 years as a successful investor. Right?
Yeah.
And today, the internet has broken down those walls and made that even more obvious to me over the last couple of years. And every time we go through a crisis, whether it's COVID, like we're in the midst of now, or an insane presidential election that we'll be talking about soon.
Yeah. Tune in for that one.
That is that is what reveals who we actually are, right? The old Warren Buffett quote, right? You find out who's swimming naked when the tide goes out, which I think is just a funny image, number one, to think about. But ultimately what it comes down to is you have to be careful and intentional in every area of your life to make sure that your self-talk and the people that you're interacting with personally and professionally are of one accord to the type of personal equity brand you want for yourself over time. Otherwise, it is not going to happen by mistake.
It's that, and I know we're wrapping up here, but when you said that, it made me realize some of the things that you taught me early on in my career. Hey, Matt, you're talking about doing this. Are you going to do this from a relational standpoint, or are you doing this from a donational standpoint? Like, am I doing this to reciprocate something, or am I doing this just because it's the right thing to do, and it doesn't matter if I get anything back out of it. Because a lot of the time, I think you recognized early on, I was in more of a donational type of situation, and just in my line of thinking, I was working, or I was giving, or I was doing what I was doing, and there was no reciprocation happening. I wasn't gaining anything from it. Not that that's what you need to go through life with at all.
Right.
But I believe health and success rely on the ability of recognizing those two things, and then making sure that you're operating in a way that supports that. You told me a couple of times, hey, Matt, if you don't mind not getting paid or not, gaining something from this, I think it's a fantastic idea. You should do it. If you think it's the right thing to do, you should do it. If it's not, and you want something different, you might want to rethink that. And that was a key lesson that you helped me understand.
Well, and I think as we wrap up, the key to understanding that is these forces are operating all around us all the time, regardless of who's in control of the government or what the economy is doing or which, era or philosophy you're living in as your kind of timeline of your life. There is always going to be, I hate to put it this way, people that are climbing up, people that are sliding down. That's just kind of the natural kind of evolution of man in a sense.
That's literally the business cycle almost by definition.
And there's a reason it's developed that way, I think, and it's just because it's the natural course of what human behavior is, in a sense, right? I mean, it was, once upon a time, I borrow a phrase from Dave Ramsey, right? Like once upon a time, it was like crawl out of the cave and go kill something to eat,
right?
And that was
definitely not like that now.
Whoever's best at that becomes the leader, of in the most rudimentary sense, and so. Yes, the world now is more sophisticated than it's ever been, and we've got more sophisticated problems than we've ever had. And we also have, by the way, more sophisticated ability to solve those problems.
Yeah.
It's not instantaneous, and it never will be. And by the way, we're going to encounter more, and we'll create more for ourselves by developing new things for ourselves as well. So it's just kind of this constant cycle where you just have to have that self-realization that a life of equity is a lifelong project.
Yep. Agreed.
Right. And you never graduate from that. You don't make it, right. You can accumulate enough stuff and become rich enough someday where nobody can bother you ever anymore. And if that's what your number one goal is as a person, I fully believe anybody is capable of doing that. But that's not really what the highest and best goals of most people we talk to are.
Right.
Most people don't really want money to be the end all goal. And so that's why I like when we take a pause on an episode like this and we use a concept related to money to talk about other big picture things that we found to be important in our conversations with people, because ultimately that's really what we want this to be about. And what we want our client relationships to be about is about people figuring out who they want to be and how that relates to who they are and what they need to do to get from point A to point B with as much efficiency as possible. So
I think
good discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic way to wrap stuff up. So with that being said, thanks again, Revolutionaries, for tuning in today. Hope you found a couple of little nuggets to mine out of this conversation that we have. We love having it with you. We're not going to bore you with, subscribing, or the reminder to subscribe and write and all that sort of stuff. We're starting to see some traffic in that regard. So we'll only do it once an episode for a while until we need more attention.
Why would we ever tell you to subscribe? Who would ever do such a thing like that?
But in case you want to, it's somewhere around here. Anyways, that being said, we appreciate you all taking that time to spend with us in this format. So again, it's a reciprocation. We appreciate that.
Very true. I want to just reflect on, we are all learning. We're learning to do this. We're on this journey together. So if you have any thoughts, just let us know. If we can help you with anything, please let us know. And as always, as we fly off this afternoon, remember to always be revolutionary.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for being revolutionary.
Being Revolutionary is produced by Matthew Phillips and Nathan Brown in partnership with Trilogy Financial. Research by Nathan Brown and Matthew Phillips. Editing, music, and recording by Paper Street Productions. Art by Matthew Phillips.
All investing involves risk, including loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. There is no guarantee that a diversified portfolio will enhance overall returns or outperform a non-diversified portfolio. Diversification does not protect against market risk.
The opinions voiced in this show, being revolutionary, are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial advisor, or tax advisor prior to investing. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly.
Matthew Phillips is an investment advisor representative for Trilogy Capital. Investment advisory services offered through Trilogy Capital Inc., a registered investment advisor. Trilogy Capital markets advisory services under the name of Trilogy Financial, an affiliated but separate legal entity. California license 0K03460. Nathan Brown is a registered representative for LPL Financial and an investment advisor representative for Trilogy Capital. Securities offered through LPL, member FINRA SIPC. California license 0F37267.